Should we start?
That's the nativity.
Wow.
Gosh.
That's pretty moving.
Good morning, and welcome to Plymouth's Sunday Forum. We're very glad you're here, whether you're here in person, here in the chapel, or watching online. And we do have a very busy morning this morning, and people will be probably coming in late, but we will go ahead and welcome them when they get here. You may have heard on this morning's news that the city of Minneapolis is posting warning signs that it must clear the current tent encampment of some 200 people. Church leaders are urging a kinder response. But it is a difficult situation, and it recurs. Housing justice cannot be achieved by any one organization, so Plymouth has collaborated with others working toward a solution. We have heard from two of our partners this fall, Katie Dillon from Align last Sunday, and Emily Bastian from Avivo last month. Chris Latendresse from Beacon will be the first presenter in the forum in January. E.J. Kelley from the Board of Outreach, Kate Tabor, our liaison with Beacon, and Karen Barstead, chair of the Racial Justice Initiative, are here this morning to talk about how our Christmas offering might be used in this context. E.J., I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, welcome. Thanks for being here this morning. This year's recipients of the Christmas offering will be our partner organizations involved in housing justice. So this Advent, in addition to having themes of hope and love and peace and joy, Plymouth is focusing on housing justice. So all the prayers during the lighting of the Advent candle are around housing. We're hosting the Homeless Memorial March coming up, and we're dedicating our offering to housing justice organizations generally to raise up the whole value around housing justice. In past years, we've focused right away on organizations that are going to receive the Christmas offering. So in essence, the past offerings have focused on recipient organizations first and financial transactions with those recipient organizations. And that is absolutely accurate, and it's something that's really important. We need to share our abundance in the form of our treasure with organizations we believe in and we partner with. But it distorts, it's one way of framing the issue, but it distorts the reality of the situation a little bit, because what gets lost in the Plymouth offering is this isn't just a one-time financial transaction that we make in December each year. There is a relationship that is year-round, year after year, and the Christmas offering is just really the culmination of that relationship in a year. And the rest of the year, we are still giving time, talent, treasure, use of our space to these partner organizations. And this morning, we want to hold that up as well. We're talking about relationship and not just a financial transaction. And again, I'm not taking away from the idea of charity and a financial transaction, but relationship is where transformation happens, we at church believe, I think. And also in the last 6 months, we have been having these wonderful conversations around values at Plymouth. And we all recognize, I think we were brought up to believe that generosity and charity are wonderful values, and they are. They're important for each of us to have individually and for us to live into as a community. But we often don't talk as much about the value of justice, and we have this fall. And that is really important, and it's a key part of who we at Plymouth say we are. Our purpose as the church remind us that we're here to further social, economic, racial, and environmental justice. And when we just focus on the organization and the programs it runs, sometimes we lose the thinking about justice in the larger sense, and how what we're doing is also here to further justice and not just charity and generosity, which is important. I'm not taking away from that, but it's equally important that we make sure we're focusing on justice as well. And we'll talk a lot this morning about relationship and what justice means, particularly in the spiritual context, and then about justice in the housing context. And then in the end, we're going to come around and talk about how that ties back into our Christmas offering. So this morning, my two friends here are going to help talk about this. And let me give you even a little bit more perspective. So Karen, we all know, and you have held so many positions at church recently, recently moderator and on deacons, and you left your position on deacons to run a racial justice initiative, or transitioned from that for the past year.
I run it.
Yes. to herd the cats. So Karen is here to talk about justice, and particularly racial justice in the context of housing. And Kate is already doing a huge amount at Plymouth in the, year and 4 months you've been here?
Yeah. We joined a year ago today,
Yes.
I guess.
So in addition to being a family of candlelighters, Kate is co-chair of our Housing Justice Committee along with Katie Dillon. Kate is a congregational organizer at Beacon. And Kate is also an ordained minister and has some perspectives theologically, spiritually, around justice as well. So I'm really glad to have you here. So let me kick this off with a quote, and then I'm going to get you two talking. These are words from Dr. Martin Luther King. And they take place in the context of the Good Samaritan story, which I think all of us, it's one of those stories we all know. So here are Dr. King's words. We are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be an initial act. One day the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be beaten and robbed as they make their way through the journey through life. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It understands that an edifice that produces beggars needs restructuring. So I do want to get to the larger spiritual question of justice, but it's also a personal question, and I'd love to start by hearing from you two. Karen, why don't you start? I mean, why are you doing racial justice? You thought it important to chair that and throw yourself into that. Why are you doing that?
I'm going to go back 45 years. When I was in 6th or 7th grade, I discovered this book that we had in our house. It was a little paperback book called The Pictorial History of the Third Reich. And it had all these photographs of the heinous things that human beings can do to other people when you categorize one particular group as being other, as being not good. And then when I was a senior in high school, my brother got me a 1-year subscription to Ms. Magazine. So that was another influence on shaping me. I'm forever grateful to my brother for that. Going forward, I think a lot about one of my favorite verses in the Bible, which is Micah 6:8. You know, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice? And the word is do. It's not pray for justice or hope for justice or think a lot about it, but do it. Another translation says act. So that's an impetus for me. Justice is a Plymouth value, and I've been a member for many years, and I have seen that played out here, and it has shaped my value system as well and cultivated it. So it's something that Plymouth does. It's something Plymouth has showed me how to do it, and so that's something that's really important to me. And finally, I call myself a follower of the teachings of Jesus. And if I am to be a follower of those teachings, that includes a whole lot of justice, because that's what Jesus did, and that's what he came for. So I'm honored to be a part of the work, and I don't have all the skills and all the knowledge to do it perfectly, but I can do it in community with all of us.
Thank you. It's great talking about justice kind of up here and theologically and all that, but it's really moving to hear people's stories. So let's hear yours.
Yeah. I really loved Seth's sermon this morning because it resonated a lot with the preparation I had done for sharing a bit of my story and my development of my theology of justice with all of you. I was raised in a really progressive family, but like so many people, I really had to clarify and distill values for myself when I was a young adult. I went straight from college to seminary, and while I was in seminary, I spent some time volunteering and living and later working in Israel-Palestine, focusing as much as I could on learning about the conflict, but it also required me to really clarify my values and my theology around peacemaking and justice. In some of the roles that I was in, I had to decide whether I would put my safety at risk for the sake of other more vulnerable people than me. And in the process of doing all of this, I got to know better who I was and what I stood for and what my faith really meant to me. This also changed how I viewed the United States. I had this lens of the conflict in Israel and Palestine as I looked back and got to know better what was happening in my own country, from how we treated our own indigenous people, how our own police have been militarized, the ways that we utilize mass incarceration, the ways we segregate and control and disinvest from communities of color. So I learned a lot about my own country from studying Israel and Palestine so closely, and it gave me a framework of values and theology that I could bring back from my work as a young adult and later middle-aged adult there to return to the US. And through all of it, I would say a driving theological theme for me has been that of liberation. I've clarified my understanding of sin and evil to be that which binds people and separates us from ourselves or from each other or from God. And liberation is the movement to be free of all that binds and separates people. When I was leaving my last position as a university chaplain, I was looking for a way to engage more directly with liberation work and with anti-racism work. And housing justice felt like an incredibly appropriate place to start, as housing discrimination has been used to bind and oppress people of color in this country since white settlers first got here. So I'm grateful to have an opportunity to disrupt and repair that legacy through the development and advocacy housing justice work I do organizing with Beacon, and I'm happy to share later in our conversation more about that.
Thank you. So let's talk a little bit more about housing justice, and maybe first about what is unjust about housing in our society. I do want to take a quote out of this nice Christmas card most of you should have received from Plymouth by now. In this, we describe housing justice as the idea that everyone deserves safe, affordable, and health-promoting housing, regardless of race, income, gender, ethnicity, ability, and more, with particular attention to the history of discrimination that has led to housing inequities. So, Karen, I wondered, let's start with you first and then go to Kate and just talk a little bit about racial justice as it applies to housing. How do you see, what does housing justice mean to someone that leads Plymouth's Racial Justice Initiative?
Well, housing justice and racial justice are like this. You can't separate the two. There was an op-ed piece in the Star Tribune not that long ago. They were talking about racial justice in housing, and there were a couple of statistics that they brought out of it that were kind of shocking to me. Some were not. They said that the average white Minnesotan in the middle 20% income bracket makes $46,000 per year more than the average black Minnesotan in the same bracket. So just by virtue of skin color, that's $46,000 a year less. And Minnesota has among the largest homeownership gaps in the nation. So we pride ourselves on being a progressive state, and yet there is this awful gap. The Brookings Institute reports that a typical home in a majority black neighborhood is undervalued by $48,000 due to racial perceptions of worth, reducing by an estimated $156 billion in the total wealth of homeowners in black neighborhoods. So just by virtue of it being owned by a black person, it gets undervalued. I mean, many of us in this room have homes in which we have equity, and that's a really nice savings buffer for us. And if you don't have that, it's a real restriction. The other statistic that came out of 2019 report was that 25.3% of black Minnesotans owned a home compared to 76.9% of white Minnesotans. And here's the real clinker for me. The median net worth was $211,000 for white households versus for black households, 0. That's the median. That's shocking. That's unacceptable. No wonder so many people are homeless. Homelessness has arisen from the legacy of slavery and the genocide of indigenous people. I'm sure the home ownership rate for our indigenous neighbors is even less than that of our black neighbors. I participated in the Mapping Prejudice Project, which is the project to look at deeds to see where restrictive covenants came in. And one of the things I did, because the deed will show the legal description of the property, one thing I did is I looked at the legal description and I was able to cross-reference it to the tax rolls. And there was a home in Edina that had a restrictive covenant. And I think about 3 years ago, that home sold for $1 million. So somebody didn't have access to that wealth simply because they were not white. We're familiar with what happened with the Rondo neighborhood when the Highway 34 went through. Not only did that remove the homes of 1 out of every 8 African American households in St. Paul, but it also blocked off or kind of cut off North Minneapolis from the rest of Minneapolis. So it kind of created this barrier there. And then 35W, that came up through a black neighborhood. And if you look at the way 35W is structured when it comes up from the south, if it had continued just going north, it would have gone up Lyndale Avenue. But instead, it goes up and then it goes like this, and then it curves up again. It deliberately went through a black neighborhood and destroyed those businesses and those homes. And that's a loss of equity, again, talking about what we have in the way of wealth. Because home ownership is the primary way that Americans create wealth and pass it on to future generations. So poverty is a big part of racial injustice and housing injustice. Rental housing discrimination has been notorious over the years. And people who are not white are often discriminated against. They're refused housing, or they're not able to negotiate a rent. A white person has an easier time negotiating a rent than a black person does.
And I think Kate has some more data and thoughts on around.
We could spend a lot of forums talking about the history of housing discrimination.
Yeah.
I think you hit on most of the things that were on my timeline, Karen. The only other kind of low light, I guess I would call it, would be the practice of redlining. Minneapolis wasn't actually particularly segregated before 1910. I was really surprised to learn that because I was really aware of how segregated we are today. But it was a shift occurred in neighborhoods due to the racial covenants that started in 1910. They really changed the nature of what the city looked like and what communities looked like. And that was only furthered by the practice of redlining that began a couple decades later, when the Federal Housing Administration had a way to rate risk factors for government-backed mortgages, giving favorable scores to neighborhoods that had racial covenants in place and were white segregated, and hazardous scores for areas where people of color lived. And this made it almost impossible for black residents to get FHA loans. From the span of the 30s to the 60s, 98% of FHA loans were given to white people. And when we think about what the location of where you live determines for you and what your ability to buy a house means for you, I mean, this impacts your access to education, the resources that are put into that education, the investment given in your community, into your jobs, your ability to get loans for anything of any kind, your access to green space, the environmental health of your community. Everything is impacted by your location and your ability to amass wealth through purchasing a home. So the intense racial disparities that Minnesota has, we have, I think, the worst racial disparity in home ownership. As Karen said, it's 3 in 4 white Minnesotans own their home, and 1 in 4 Black Minnesotans own their home. And this didn't happen by accident. It happened through intentional policies and practices that further segregation today that we are fighting against.
Can I just add a little tidbit? I worked in banking, and I started out in banking in the 1970s. Shortly before I got into the lending side of it, I learned that for many years, appraisers, when they would do appraisals of properties, they used as code the words "shows pride of ownership." And that was code for white person lives here. So when I came into it, they had banned that phrase from appraisals, but I just remember that sticking out as another way that you discriminate very sneakily.
So this is helpful. You're teeing up the system and the things in the system that have created this problem. It's not just one particular attitude. It's systemic injustice is what we call it. And so now let's start focusing on some of Plymouth's partner organizations and how they're approaching dismantling this systemic injustice. Kate, you work at Beacon, and I think everyone here knows who Beacon is and its relationship to Plymouth. And when I think of Beacon initially, I think of it as a builder. I think of it as owning Lydia across the streets or Nicollet Square. But there's more to what Beacon does, a lot more than that. Am I right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Great question. I wonder who wrote that. So yeah, I would say Beacon's primary identity and story of origin was around housing development and developing deeply affordable, supportive services housing. We also took on a shelter program with 2 locations until COVID, and then 1 location sheltering families. We've since passed that shelter program on to another provider, but it's really shaped the experience of Beacon's board and staff and our strategic plan over the years. So we learned through the development that we've done, and we learned through the relationships we had with families in shelter about the gaps that exist in our society that have led to the need, both the need for the kind of affordable housing that we do, but also how hard it is to build, how unnecessarily hard it is to build, and the gaps that are there that don't support the families that ended up in shelter and didn't need to end up homeless and in shelter. And because of those experiences and recognizing those gaps, Beacon particularly the last 5 years, has really escalated our policy advocacy work. So for example, to address the experiences that we'd seen in our shelter families, we launched a campaign called Bring It Home Minnesota, because only 1 in 4 households in Minnesota that are eligible for rental assistance actually receive it. And even those households have to wait years to gain access to that rental assistance. And this is not acceptable. We have the means, and we need to build the will to invest public resources in this. So Bring It Home Minnesota is a campaign at the state level to invest state funds in filling that gap of rental assistance for families who need it. And this is families who are spending over 30% of their annual income towards rent. And we actually, after 4 or 5 years of this advocacy work, last year we passed our first version, unprecedented state program for Bring It Home. There will be dedicated funds coming in to provide between 5,000 and 6,000 households rental assistance who would not have had it earlier. And we are continuing this campaign because that is not filling the rest of the gap. We plan to keep strengthening, expanding, and helping to implement Bring It Home, but that's one of our big campaigns. Another campaign that was related to the gaps we were seeing in housing development policy. There is a line item in the budget of the city of Minneapolis called the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And this is one that, they send out RFPs and developers send in proposals and you get scored according to certain metrics. And we were noticing that even when our proposals scored high, we didn't always get the money. And we were noticing that developments that got the money weren't always doing the most affordable housing. They were doing middle affordable housing. And one thing that's really important to know about this is that the federal government is the one that determines what is the area median income. And they include the entire 7-county metro area in that statistic, or in that number. So the area median income, and we talk about this in Minneapolis, is $119,000 a year for a family of 4. Do you think that that's the area median income for the city of Minneapolis? The city of Minneapolis is closer to like $66,000 is the area median income for a family of 4 in the city. But yet, all the government, all the programs, all the proposals, all the scoring metrics are talking about that federal number of area median income. So we're looking at the proposals that were winning the money from this Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and it was at 50, 60% of the area median income, which is at 100% of Minneapolis's median income, right? 100%, not 30, 50, 60. So we were like, this doesn't match. And I don't think that the city officials who are patting themselves on the back about building affordable housing, I don't know how much the city council members actually understand area median income and what this housing is actually building. And we want to see this trust fund that's called the Affordable Housing Trust Fund go to actually building genuinely affordable housing. So we began a campaign. We snappily called it the Affordable Housing Trust Fund campaign. And we had a team of folks, some from right here. Peter Eichten has been really involved in this campaign, educating cities, advocating with city staff and educating city council members about affordability, taking them on tours of our buildings to explain what deeply affordable housing looks like, what population it's serving, the challenges that represents, the supportive services that are necessary to support that population, and explaining how difficult it is to put all the jigsaw puzzle pieces together to get this built, and how significant the trust fund money is in jumpstarting all those other public investments. And this spring, you guys, the city staff who told us we had no business originally advocating about this, they have now, as of last spring, they proposed new language saying that the program goals for the trust fund are for deeply affordable 30% AMI housing and for units coming out of for people coming out of homelessness. This is huge. They wrote it down. This is who it's for. And they changed the scoring metrics to reflect that in some ways. And so we've been we were happy, but we were also like, well, you didn't put any metrics in there to hold yourselves accountable to that. So we've been kind of waiting until the end of this year to see what allocations were actually made out of that fund. And you guys, they've increased by like 20% the number of units of deeply affordable housing that they're funding out of this fund. So we are so motivated to engage in these kinds of advocacy campaigns. And because we work with almost 100 congregations mobilizing advocates like you, we get heard and things do change. Things are possible to change. And the situation out there right now is very bleak. You've probably seen a lot of articles coming through. The news is really covering how many challenges the affordable housing landscape is facing right now. But we've proven that we can build power for change, and we need each one of us.
So that's really part of the theme, and we'll get the questions in a minute for the morning, is a lot of these organizations we partner with, and we appreciate their kind of nitty-gritty programs where we're working with them to get something done, like build a house or build a development across the street. There's a huge amount of advocacy these organizations do as well, and what we're trying to do right now is call attention to that. And another one that I just want to mention, given Karen and Kate's comments about the housing and equity gap in the Twin Cities, is Habitat for Humanity. How many people here have at some point in their life picked up a hammer and worked on a habitat? So virtually everyone in the room, and that is wonderful. That's a key part of what Habitat does, but just like Beacon, Habitat does a huge amount of advocacy. And that's critical for getting some of this done. So just looking at their website, Twin Cities Habitat for Humanity advocates in the federal, state, and local levels. Through advocacy, we build relationship with lawmakers and create new opportunities for affordable housing throughout the Twin Cities. And I note a couple of the programs they're working on. One is that they've developed with the Minnesota Realtors Association a first-generation home buyer down payment assistance program. So this is getting at that lack of wealth creation, and they're trying to get $176 million of support to support 5,000 first-generation home buyers. And here's how they talk about their mission now. At Twin Cities Habitat for Humanity, we are building forward with intention by centering our work around those most historically impacted by racist housing practices. Our new Advancing Black Home Ownership program responds to community feedback, removes barriers to home ownership, and aims to narrow racial disparities in housing. So same idea. Habitat is great. We give money as part of our community fund to Habitat every year. We are involved in direct relationship with Habitat when we go and build and pick up a hammer and work alongside families. And then Habitat is involved in justice work, trying to dismantle these inequities that have been set up over the years. Just one more, we're starting to run out of time, and I want to circle back to our Christmas offering. But a number of Karen is at a racial vigil that Peter talked about this morning, a racial justice vigil every Tuesday. And this coming Thursday, we have a homeless memorial march and service. And I want to ask you about just the importance around justice work of, public acts, vigils, marches, services of remembrance for people who have died while homeless. How important is that to advancing the cause of justice?
I think a big part of the importance is that it transforms us. It is transformational. When I'm out on the street with a sign and somebody honks their horn in support of my sign that might say Native Lives Matter, that reminds me that this is important work, that I'm showing to the community that racial justice did not end, or racial injustice did not end with Derek Chauvin going to prison. This is still going on, and I want to demonstrate that, and it speaks to me. And there are people who will say, well, all lives matter, and we will say, yes, you're right, they all do. And people will say, you need to be doing more than this. And we will say, you're right, we do. We need to be doing more than this. So the vigil is a big, big part of it. The other thing is, it kind of ties in with the work of the Campus Task Force, which is going to be doing more work in the coming year, building relationships. I screwed up my courage, and I went to a Stevens Square fall festival that they had and met some of the people there, and I've had coffee with a couple of them a couple of times, and just building those relationships and finding out who's in our neighborhood, who are the business owners, what are the places that people go to that are really important to them. I learned that Stevens Square Park is their front yard, because most of those people live in apartments and condos and don't have much green space. And so they have a park, and that park is really important to them. And I'm becoming more aware of safety issues in the neighborhood. So building relationships is, it's so important in this work.
So let me, I may have one closing question for you, but let me move on to, kind of saved it for the end, like the teacher that doesn't hand out the handouts until you get to the very end. So these are our housing justice partners. Beacon, Katie spoke about Align last week. Habitat, as I mentioned earlier, Simpson Housing. We support supportive services at Lydia. So Avivo runs the supportive services in Beacon's property across the street, and we write a check that's restricted to go to Lydia and pay for community sort of things going on over there. And then Zamia Theater, we support with money, and they have an office downstairs where our ministers are. They store their they store their props here, and they this fall did Prairie Homeless Companion here. So Zamia Theater is a theater that tells the story of people with lived experiences of homelessness, and the actors all have lived experience of homelessness. So this is where our Christmas offering is going, and I want to show how they all fit together. So this diagram on the left, I go through different interventions, starting with the idea, and Katie talked about this last week, the best homeless program is preventing people from becoming homeless in the first place. And so there are programs and organizations in the county that have emergency rental assistance, and one of the groups that does it is Align. Align Minneapolis, it used to be called Downtown Congregations to End Homelessness. So when we support our housing partners, we're supporting emergency rental assistance. Then there's what we all think of with homelessness, and there's emergency shelter. And Simpson is one of our partners and runs emergency shelter, a large emergency shelter program. Next, the way I've set this up, there's deeply affordable congregate housing, so people living in the same place with supporting services, and that's really one of Beacon's sweet spots, although we learned this morning that justice work is as well, and Lydia Apartments across the way is an example of that. It's deeply affordable housing, and there's supportive services, case management, career management, everything being provided for residents there. Then there is scattered site and congregate site supportive services. So this might be, some people have a housing voucher and are living in an apartment on their own but still need supportive services. So Simpson Housing does that as well as Avivo. And Simpson partners with Beacon at like 66 West, and at 66 West, it's Simpson who we support, that does the supportive services. It's Avivo across the street, Simpson there, and then home ownership and really getting people into home ownership. So you see how we're moving along here. That's Habitat. And then what we really wanted to talk about this morning, because we all seem to be able to identify Habitat with home ownership and Simpson with shelter, is a huge part of what they all do that's so critical is advocacy and justice work. So let me show you this. And this is what we at Plymouth try to do in an outreach, is charity and generosity are incredibly important. Being in relationship and providing people with a meal or helping build houses or paint, that sort of thing is directly important, and justice work is important. So we try to support organizations where we have a mix of doing all that. I hate to use this term in a church, but it's kind of like a mutual fund. We're supporting groups that do, where it's charitable sort of work, and they're maybe giving some clothes away or that sort of thing, where they're really directly serving someone, and then this justice work as well. And we as a church need to do that. It's just that historically, I think, going back 20, 30 years, we've been focused as a church maybe more on charity and generosity and some direct service and justice as well. And right now we're trying to put this bigger emphasis on justice. You got to do both. So one way we can do the charity work is by giving to the Christmas offering. We also have, in this season's Flame, Sarah Bergen wrote an article on all the other ways you can get involved, whether it's with Habitat or different housing organizations, and we have copies of that, of just that page over there. So that would be great, because that's year-round. And then in terms of being further involved in Plymouth's justice work here and taking it out into the community, the Racial Justice Initiative meets on the fourth Wednesday of every month?
Mm-hmm. Typically, yeah.
And the 7th of January after the second service.
Right.
And the Housing Justice Committee is going to meet next on January 3rd at 6, so it's a Wednesday night. So Questions?
I'm just going to add a short story. I talked to a regular attendee here at Plymouth Church this morning, and this person said that their rent, they live in affordable housing, is going up $22 a month beginning in January, with $18 a month late fees if payments come in late, and this person is over $500 behind. And hearing that story told me, this is real. This is real. This person is a friend, someone I love, and in a country of wealth, this should not be
And this is an
happening.
example where perhaps the person should look into emergency rental assistance program because, and Katie talked about this last week, it's the right thing to do morally, ethically, compassionately, but it's also cheaper to keep someone in their place than to
Yes.
have to support them in shelter and all the case management going through that. That should not be the primary reason to do it, but it's cheaper to do rental assistance. Go ahead, Jackie.
Is there a question?
I think many of us, when we think of homelessness, we think of bricks and mortar. If we could only get people in a safe, warm place. And you've mentioned numerous times supportive services. Could you elaborate a bit on just the types of things the basic things that people need in addition to a dwelling?
Sure. So we focus at Beacon on supportive service housing because lots of research has shown that it's the most effective way to get people stable and ready to start thriving when they're coming out of homelessness or severe housing insecurity. So yeah, case management is provided, and this is really tailored to the individual, which is why it's so impactful. Whether people need support with career readiness, whether they need support through their education endeavors, if they need support in addiction recovery, if they need support with their mental health. These are all pieces that supportive services can provide through case management. And at Beacon, we have tailored our buildings often to specific populations, whether it's families. We have a building for men coming out of incarceration, and we partner with supportive services agencies that have expertise in doing the particular kind of case management that population needs. So folks at Plymouth often hear about Nicollet Square. That's for youth and young adults coming out of homelessness, and we partner with YouthLink. And they have the expertise to work particularly with those populations.
Kate, can you say a little bit more about, in general, what's happening with development and the housing stock in Minneapolis and how much city policy is sort of like you described? Are there broader city policies that are driving it? Because it seems like there's a lot of the type of development that you were talking about that the apartment buildings, the growth, that seems sort of misaligned with what we need in general. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm still in the midst of my learning curve on housing and policy, but it is exponentially easier to build even the 60% kind of AMI affordable housing than it is the very deeply affordable. You need so much more public resources. There are kind of 3 buckets of funding that you have to put all the pieces together in order to build the kind of housing that Beacon does, which is proven to be the most successful at getting people permanently out of homelessness. There's the bucket of capital funding. That is what the Affordable Housing Trust Fund contributes to, but you need capital funding from, entity after entity after entity in order to get all the pieces together to actually have enough capital. There's the bucket of rental assistance. So we also have to apply for project-based vouchers, for housing support, because in order to be financially sustainable, there needs to be a guaranteed source of income because we know we're serving populations that aren't going to be able to provide that themselves. And the last bucket is the bucket for services funding. Increasingly, I think that there's more and more acknowledgement that kind of funding is necessary to invest in as we see the populations in our communities that are struggling so much with housing security. Supportive services is time after time, we see the evidence that it works. But as of now, there's no dedicated funding for families coming out of homelessness. Because of advocacy from a coalition of housing organizations, we do have some dedicated funding for homeless youth, but we don't have any for families once the parents are older than 25 years old. So there's something about just how much resources are needed, and the fact that there are gaps in dedicated sources for that funding.
Can I add one thing to that? And Kareem Murphy was here earlier this morning, and he always asked me to make the follow-up on the pitch you're making. Last session, we had this huge budget surplus, and a lot of it went to housing, but it's really the bricks and mortar. What needs to get funded on a year after year basis is the supportive services you're talking about, and that's
and the rent.
and the rent, yes. And that's tight. And even going to the shelters right now, Simpson and the other shelters just did something that's absolutely right. They used to kick people out at 9 in the morning. You'd see people leaving and they'd go to the library or ride the rails. They're now providing for 24/7 service, 365 days a year. That costs money. And the supportive services cost money. And so anyway, I'll stop there, but that's what still needs to be funded through Hennepin County, through the state, and through gifts like we give.
And increasingly, starting this year, we're spending millions of dollars on security. This is not something that we have had to do before, but increasingly you've heard about how unsafe neighborhoods have become. We have, I mean, just the